Hello, I'm Sensei Alex Akio. I'd like to welcome you to this episode of Dharma Sunday, where I take canonical Buddhist teachings and tie them in with real-world events. The topic of today's discussion is Reflections on 2020, Protest, Pandemics, and Social Isolation. These teachings are offered free of charge, but if you'd like to make a contribution, information for PayPal and CashApp are in the description for this talk. Also, if you'd like to do a deep dive into Buddhist training, check out my book, Perfectly Ordinary Buddhist Teachings for Everyday Life. It's available on Amazon, and there's a link to a sample chapter of the book also in the description. Finally, if you'd like to take part in future live streams, we meet every Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And to take part, you just need to like this video and subscribe to the channel so that you receive notifications. So I think we can all agree that 2020 sucked. I'm not sure I've met anyone who said that it was the best year ever. It was very difficult for a variety of reasons. There were protests all across the country. Some of them were violent, resulting in buildings being burned down. In some cases, people were killed. We have the coronavirus pandemic that is still ongoing. I remember when we were told it would only be 2 weeks. Then we were told it'd be a month. And here we are almost a year later, still in the midst of it. And finally, we've had to deal with all the social isolation that goes along with a pandemic, being told that we have to wear masks, that we have to remain 6 feet from people when we speak with them, that we can't gather with loved ones for their safety and our own. And it's just a hard time. And as Americans, we're not strangers to tragedy. There's been lots of things, even my own lifetime, that have been very difficult and very damaging. But I think what made 2020 especially hard was that it was ongoing. It wasn't a single event and then we dealt with that. It was one thing, then another, and then another, and they're all happening at the same time. So what do we do? What do we do about pandemics? What do we do about social isolation? What do we do about protests that are rocking our cities? And I didn't have the answer, so I did what I always do in these situations, and I went to the sutras to try and find an answer. But before we get into that, I want to make sure you know I'm not going to discuss the political side of these issues. Not because it's not important, I just think that's sort of been beat to death. There are a lot of people on a lot of other channels who have talked about the politics of the things I've named, and spirituality and politics aren't separate. However, I've seen very few people talk about the Buddhist aspect of this and the Dharma teachings that we can take from these events. So that will be my focus for this evening. So the question becomes, how would Buddha respond to 2020? What would he do if he were in our shoes? And I believe what he would do is quote to us the fire sermon, which is a sermon in which he discusses with his monks the nature of reality and the nature of our lives on this planet. And he discusses that and describes it by saying, the world is burning. Burning with what? Burning with the fire of greed, with the fire of hate, with the fire of delusion, with birth, aging, and death, with sorrow, with lamentation, with pain, grief, and despair. It is burning. Now, that's a pretty intense statement. He's describing the nature of our reality, and he's saying that it's on fire. And it's on fire with things that hurt us. It's on fire with greed. It's on fire with hate. It's on fire with delusion. Greed, hate, and delusion being the three poisons, as you probably know. But when I read that now, as compared to when I read it at the beginning of my practice, I read that as a statement of hope. a statement of good tidings, because what he's saying essentially is that suffering is a natural part of human existence. Not that we like it, not that we want to suffer, but just that it's a part of the package. And what that means is we're not doing anything wrong. We haven't done anything to deserve the suffering that we're enduring. We're not being punished. This is just something that happens. Protests happen, pandemics happen, social isolation happen. So we have to understand that and be willing to accept it. And once we're able to accept it, we realize something else. That in these practices that we're doing in Buddhist training, this is a practice designed specifically to deal with what we're dealing with right now. Buddhism was made for years like 2020. It was made to deal with protests, pandemics, social isolation, greed, hate, delusion, birth, aging, sickness, and death. So we have the problem of 2020, but in Buddhism, we have the cure. We have the practice of the Dharma. So that's what gives me hope. Not that I enjoyed 2020, but that I have a practice, I have a cure that's designed specifically to deal with all of the pain and all of the suffering of the previous year. And not only that, but it's also designed to deal with all the pain and the suffering that may happen in years to come. A lot of times, we as Buddhists kind of get the story backwards. We think that the purpose of this practice is to take pictures for Instagram or to chat with our friends about philosophy. But Buddha didn't create Buddhism because he was happy. He created it because he was suffering, because he was in pain, just like we're in pain now. So just like this practice worked for him to help him end his own suffering, it's also going to help us end our own suffering. But how do we do that? Well, first things first, we have to understand the teaching of karma. And in karma, essentially, it's just cause and effect in Buddhism. We throw a ball up in the air. That's a cause. The effect is that it falls down to the earth. But karma exists and suffering exists in three phases. There's personal karma, there's impersonal karma, and then there's what I call worldly karma. So personal karma, imagine that we're in a house with roommates, is I eat a meal, I dirty up a bunch of dishes, they're in the sink, now I don't have dishes to eat off of. So that's karma I created. And Buddhism addresses that. Well, I did a thing, it was unskillful. In the future, I'll be more careful, and I'll make sure I wash my dishes. That's personal karma. Impersonal karma is my roommate dirtied up the dishes, and now there's nothing to eat off of. And Buddhism deals with that as well through the practices of right speech and right action. We interact with our roommate skillfully and work out a way for us to ensure that there are always clean dishes. Maybe we work out a rotation with them where I clean them one night, they clean the next night. Maybe we just agree to all eat off of paper plates. Who knows? But there's also worldly karma. And worldly karma is a hurricane comes and knocks over the house. So there's no clean plates to eat off of because there's no house. And that's not something that I did. That's not something my roommate did. That's just something that happened. Something that none of us have control over, that no one's to blame for. And when I look at the suffering of 2020, what I see is a lot of worldly karma. The protests, the pandemics, the social isolation. And a lot of the suffering that was caused unnecessarily came because we were treating worldly karma like it was personal. So we either turned inward and thought we were to blame, that we did something wrong, or we thought that someone else did something wrong. And this is where conspiracy theories come from. There must be someone in a dark room with a mustache somewhere that planned this all out. But Buddha would say otherwise. Buddha would say that people have been getting sick for tens of thousands of years. People have been fighting for tens of thousands of years. People have been separated from their loved ones for tens of thousands of years. And going back to why the fire sermon is a sermon of hope, is that we as human beings have overcome those challenges for tens of thousands of years. So this is nothing new. This is something that our ancestors dealt with and they survived, so we also will survive. It may not seem like it at times. It's going to be hard, but we can make it through it just like they did, just like the Buddha did. We were built for this, so to speak. But Buddha isn't a magician. He doesn't snap his fingers and then our suffering disappears. He's more of a good friend. He holds our hand in the midst of our suffering, and he helps us work through it together. So that should be our goal, not that we'll snap our fingers one day and there will be no more sickness, no more social isolation, no more protests, but rather that we'll learn to hold each other's hands and walk skillfully through the fire of our suffering. We can see this in Buddha's own example. Again, he was suffering, he was in pain, so much so that he walked away from a lavish lifestyle as a prince and walked the spiritual path. And then he sat under the Bodhi tree. He realized enlightenment after taking the vow, I will not move from this spot, even if the flesh melts from my bones, until I found a way to end sorrow for all beings. And then what did he do? He realized enlightenment, he got up from that spot, and he walked out into the world. So that's what we do as Buddhists. We walk out into the world. This is shown in the Bodhisattva Vows, which state, sentient beings are numberless, I'll save them. Delusions are endless, I'll see through them. The teachings are infinite, I'll learn them. The Buddha way is difficult, I'll walk the path. Now, anyone who pays attention to those vows realizes that they're impossible. There's no way to save all sentient beings from suffering if they're numberless. But we're taking a vow to do it. There's no way to learn all of the teachings if they're numberless. But we take a vow to do it because it's not the end result that matters in Buddhism, it's the attempt. What we're doing is we're promising to try, to do our best. And we understand that we're going to fail sometimes. And that's okay. We see this in the story of Kannan, the Bodhisattva of compassion, who, after taking the vow to save all sentient beings from suffering, went down into the hell realms and emptied them of all the human beings that were there. And after she emptied hell, she blinked, and hell was filled again with another mass of human beings. So that's what Kannan, the Bodhisattva of compassion, does. She goes into hell, she saves sentient beings, and then more show up. And she goes down, she saves those, and more show up. She takes a vow to try. When we look at the example of Buddha, of Harriet Tubman, of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it's the same thing. It's the Bodhisattva path. Buddha did not end suffering for all sentient beings in his lifetime, but he made the attempt, and in doing so, he saved some. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. did not end racism in the United States of America forever and all time, but by making the attempt, he made it better. Harriet Tubman did not save all the slaves that were in the United States during her lifetime, but she saved a lot because she was willing to make the attempt. And I think one of the reasons that 2020 was so hard, at least for me, is because we kept thinking and wanting for the perfect solution to appear. We kept expecting that we would find a way to make everything better overnight. And what Buddha reminds us is that suffering is part of life, but that doesn't mean we can't make it better over time if we're willing to try. And that's our practice. We don't need to fix everything. We put a lot of pressure on ourselves as spiritual practitioners to make sure no one's suffering and no one's in pain. But we don't need to do that. We just need to do the best we can for ourselves and for other people, just like the people I just named. Now, that being said, it's always helpful to have some practical steps to cope with the suffering and the pain that we're experiencing. And if Buddhism is anything, it's practical. And as we go into 2021, there's going to be more pain and more suffering. So how do we deal with that? And here are the 3 things that helped me in 2020. And I hope they help you as we move into 2021. The first was gratitude meditations. So the first noble truth of Buddhism states life is suffering. And we saw that in the fire sermon. But the other side of suffering is gratitude. Because if we accept the fact that there is a lot of suffering in life and that it's a natural part of life, we're better able to understand and appreciate the points when we're not suffering. We're better able to understand and appreciate the things that bring us joy. And this is a problem we have in the West, is because we think life is always supposed to be good, we take it for granted when life is good. We take it for granted when we have a warm, safe place to sleep, when we have clothes to wear. But if we take the opposite view that, no, suffering is normal, joy is abnormal, then every time we experience joy, we appreciate it more. And that's why gratitude meditations are so important. An example of this is something I do every morning when I go outside. Where I live, it's very cold right now. There's several inches of snow on the ground. At night, the temperature gets into single digits. Now, I understand life is suffering, so I understand that it's natural for it to be cold and windy outside. And because I understand that, I also understand that it's completely unnatural that I have a warm coat that I can put on, that I have heavy boots and long underwear I can put under my clothes, so much so that when I go outside, I'm actually very comfortable. In spite of all the suffering, in spite of all the cold and the wind and the gray dampness of winter that's happening, I can go out and be comfortable because of the warm clothing I have. So there's the suffering of the cold, and there's the gratitude because I have a coat to wear. And we can do these types of gratitude meditations with everything in life. Hunger and starvation is natural. It's normal. It's been part of human existence for tens of thousands of years, and yet there's food in my refrigerator. Sleeping outside and being unsafe is a normal, natural part of human existence, and yet I have a warm, safe place to sleep. It's very normal and natural to be sick. Again, it's been part of human existence from the beginning, and yet here I am with a body that's healthy and strong that allows me to practice the Dharma. These sorts of gratitude meditations, these contemplations, can be very useful as we deal with suffering. Yes, we are dealing with a pandemic and it sucks. But what about all those years where we didn't have to deal with this? We're socially isolated from our friends and it sucks. But what about all of those years where we can go over and spend time with them whenever we wanted to? And as I think about that, as I'm grateful for the things I had, even though they were taken away, the fact that I got to have them anyway, even if it wasn't forever, fills me with warmth. And it helps me deal with the fact that I don't have those things now. So gratitude contemplations can be very important during this time. Also, we can work to create our own mini Pure Land. Pure Land in Buddhism is a land of infinite bliss. I've talked about them before, so I won't go too deep into the teaching now. But put simply, we are Buddhas. And as Buddhas, we have the ability to create a Pure Land, just like we see in the Lotus Sutra and the Nirvana Sutra and the Vimalakirti Sutra, even though we may or may not have miracle powers. So what I've done in my own practice, and I encourage you to do the same, is instead of trying to save the entire world, just save a small part of it. Maybe this is your home, maybe it's your job, maybe it's your family. Just pick one small part of the world that you're going to be responsible for, that you're going to take care of. So for me, in my own practice, this is my fish, this is my cat, my loved ones, my houseplants. I can't save all sentient beings. I accept this. But I can make sure life is as good for them as it possibly can be. I can make sure my plants are watered and fertilized. I can make sure my cat has food in his bowl, even though he's already eating twice today. I can ensure that my fish tank is cleaned regularly. And in doing that, as I look at all the other suffering that's happening in the world, the worldly karma that I have no control over, I take comfort in the fact, well, at least I was able to fix this, right? I can't make the pandemic end overnight, but I was able to feed my cat, and now he's comfortable and he's sleeping. I can't go and spend time with my friends like I want because, of various reasons, but my houseplants are doing well, right? And there's a comfort in that. There's a locus of control that is external that we're pulling inside of ourselves. The world doesn't control my happiness anymore. I do. So you can do the same, and I encourage you to do that. Find a few things in life that you have control over and focus on those things. Care for them. Make them as comfortable, as happy as you can. And when you're overwhelmed, which you will be because you're a human being, just like me, just like Buddha, focus on those things and remember the good you're doing for them. And finally, just know when to ask for help. And this is especially important because in the West, we have this idea that we should be able to fix things on our own, that we should be able to go it alone, that we don't need help. And there is a self-power aspect to Buddhist practice. We meditate, generally by ourselves, or even if we're in a group, we do it silently. So if our eyes are closed, it can seem like we're by ourselves. But there's an other power aspect as well. So it's okay to need help, to be overwhelmed. And this can look like a lot of different things. Maybe we call a loved one and share our concerns with them. Maybe we go more deeply into our practice. I know for myself personally, the Nimbutsu chant has been very helpful. Namu Amida Butsu, I take refuge in Amida Buddha, generally is an expression of gratitude. I'm grateful for all of the nice things that I receive. I'm grateful for my original enlightenment, but it can also be an expression of lamentation, an expression that I just can't do this by myself. This burden is too hard to bear. And if it is too hard to bear, we don't have to carry it ourselves. That's the beauty of our practice. We can take our hardship and we can give it to Buddha, and he'll carry it for us for a short period of time. We can take the backpack off, we can give it to our friend, we can regain our strength, and we can take it back once we're renewed. And we can do this through our chanting, through our meditation, through prostrations, whatever our preferred practice is. Just remember that we can rely on that if we need help. It's okay to turn off the news and say, you know what, I just need to meditate for 20 minutes to just cleanse myself of all of this for a while. Or I just need to go work in my garden. I just need to read a book. Whatever our spiritual practice looks like, whatever our favorite hobby is, whether it's exercise or gardening or cooking. We like creating delicious meals. Find a spiritual practice, either a traditional one, like I had mentioned earlier, or one that's more associated with daily life, and rely on that if we're feeling overwhelmed. And understand that this is normal and it's natural. And it's exactly what Buddha did when he sat under the Bodhi tree 2,600 years ago. That's why, after he realized enlightenment, he continued practicing for another 45 years until his death. Because he needed help sometimes, and so do we. And that's perfectly all right. Amitabha. So that's the talk for today. I hope it was helpful. If you'd like to ask me questions, either about the talk, about Buddhism in general, or just have some comments you'd like to share with the group, please type them in the chat. I'll be more than happy to respond. While we're waiting for those to come in, I'll just make a few announcements. Dharma Sunday happens every Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you'd like to take part in the live stream, just make sure you like the video and subscribe. Hit the notification bell. We also do meditation and sutra study every Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That practice is a little different. Instead of just doing the Dharma talk, we also do a 15-minute guided meditation, followed by a reading from a sutra. This week, we'll be starting the Lotus Sutra. Then there's a Dharma talk and a Q&A. Let's see. I think that's it. It looks like we have some comments coming in. So David Oliver gave the bow emoji. Thank you, David. It's good to see you. Frank Gingiosi also bowed. Frank, it's good to see you. Thank you. And Allison Griffin clapped and also did the bow emoji. Thank you, Allison. It's good to see you as well. I'll be honest, Sangha has been very important to me in 2020 and also in 2021. I think sometimes in our hubris, we think we can go the path alone. And sometimes it takes hardship like we've experienced and are still experiencing to realize we need our fellow spiritual practitioners. So gathering in groups like this can be very important. So I thank all of you for taking part. Diva Buddha X says, imagine a painting with a loud, raging waterfall next to a tree with a bird sleeping. The waterfall represents chaos of the external world, and the bird represents inner peace. True peace is within. Yes, that's absolutely true. That's a very good insight, Diva. Good point. And it can be helpful sometimes to remember that this world we're looking at is a painting. It's real, it's beautiful, but it's not the whole picture. Sometimes we can be the bird in the tree, and that's fine too. But in order to do that, we have to remember we're looking at a painting. So, great insight. Frank Ingiosi says, I sometimes find unexpected comfort in reliving suffering of my personal past. Is there a usefulness to this? Yes, there is. I've had similar experiences. I don't know if this is exactly what you're describing, but I know at times it's helpful to remember, like, okay, this sucks, but I've been in a lot worse situations before, right? This isn't ideal, but the way I'm dealing with this suffering now is so much better than I would have dealt with it 10 years ago. And just remembering that fact, kind of giving ourselves some credit, if you will, that we've come a long way in our journey. And just remembering that just because we're suffering doesn't mean that we failed. We've suffered in the past too. And we survived that suffering, so we'll survive this suffering. And even better, we're dealing with our suffering now in a more skillful way than we dealt with it in the past. I think that can be a useful contemplation. It's a little bit more of an advanced practice. I think if we're doing that as beginners, there's a risk that we'll just start beating ourselves up. I can't believe I did that in the past. That was so foolish, etc. But if we can do it skillfully, if we can look at our past suffering and look at it through the proper lens, I do think that's a helpful practice. Yes. Good insight. Allison Griffin says, I do some animal rescue, and the realization you can't save them all is crucial to not burning out or falling into depression chronically or just giving up. Yes, Allison, that is 100% true. So I volunteer as a chaplain for various nonprofits in my area, and I work with a lot of activists. And a lot of them deal with burnout for the exact reason that you mentioned, because they think that I'm doing this work, but this problem still exists. Therefore, I must be failing. You know, I had this conversation, this person didn't change their mind, we did this action, and, you know, this oppressive system still exists. And I always remind them of the Bodhisattva Vows, which animal rescue is a perfect example of that, is our promise is not to save them all. We're accepting the fact that we can't. It's built into the vows. Sentient beings are numberless. I'll save them. But if we remind ourselves that we're not here to save everyone, we're just here to try. But there are times when we won't be able to save ourselves, but we're still going to try. That's so important. And I think that is where a lot of the suffering that we saw in 2020 came from, is because people were expecting things to be solved overnight, that everything would be fixed overnight. And then when it wasn't, well, who's to blame, right? So we either turn that anger inward and we're mad at ourselves, or we turn that anger outward and we're mad at other people. And that is the cause of so much of the social unrest that we saw. Whereas instead of dividing the country, if we'd understood, like you said, I can't save them all, I think it could have been a unifying force. Unfortunately, it largely wasn't, but I think it will be in the future. I try to be an optimist. But yeah, that was an excellent insight, Allison. Thank you for sharing that. If you're just tuning in, we're doing the Q&A portion of tonight's talk. So if you'd like to ask questions about tonight's talk, about Buddhism in general, or if you just have a comment you'd like to share, now's the time to do so. If you'd like to watch the talk from the beginning, you can just rewind to the start of the stream and do that. And as a reminder, we do this every Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Okay, looks like that's it in the chat. I'll give it a few moments to see if anything else. Oh, Allison Griffin says, right, patience, the paramita that I must practice a lot. Patience is difficult. It is a difficult thing. And I think that's why Buddha mentions it so much. Patience, forbearance. Because I think this is human nature in general, but I think it's also very true of Westerners, is that we are not patient people. Because we live in a capitalist society where if I have enough money, I can get things quickly. And if we don't have money, we're told that if we work hard enough, we'll get things quickly. And that's not always true in life. It's definitely not true in spiritual practice. It's always funny to me that no one sits down at the piano and expects that they'll be a virtuoso overnight. They never go into the gym and think they'll be able to bench press 300 pounds overnight. But when it comes to spiritual practice, for some reason, everyone thinks that they're going to sit in meditation one time and be a perfectly enlightened being. And that's just not the case. Patience is so important. I'd say, I was going to say it's the most important, but I won't go that far. I will say that it's the foundation of a lot of things, because we have to be willing to be patient. And I think with a lot of the suffering we've experienced over 2020 and that we're still experiencing now, patience is going to be key. Eventually, the pandemic will be over. Eventually, we'll be able to meet in person. Eventually, we'll be able to turn on the news and not see buildings being burned to the ground. But it's going to take time. It's going to take patience, which is one of the paramitas for a reason. Because it's important now, and it was important 2,600 years ago when the Buddha was dealing with his own suffering, his own pandemics, his own social isolation, his own, political unrest. I think of Dogen, who, when you read the text, there was so much warfare around his monastery that there were days where the river nearby ran red with blood and with body parts. Right? So going back to Frank's comment about thinking about suffering and reliving suffering, what I found helpful is sometimes reliving the suffering of the patriarchs and the matriarchs that came before. This is terrible. What did Buddha deal with? His cousin tried to kill him. His whole family was wiped out, except for a few who were part of the monastic order. What did Dogen deal with? They tried to assassinate him. There were body parts in the river. And remembering that doesn't obviously belittle that suffering, but it puts our own suffering into perspective, that this is terrible and it sucks. But suffering is part of life. And just like the people I mentioned were able to work through their own suffering by being, amongst other things, patient, if we're patient, we can work through this suffering as well. This is why I said the fire sermon isn't depressing, it's hopeful. for me. It's a reminder that, this is just a natural part of life. And humans have dealt with it for tens of thousands of years, and we will do the same. Allison Griffin says, and Shinran was persecuted greatly. Yes, he was. That's a very interesting story with Shinran and Honen, and how, they were almost executed, but instead they were just essentially excommunicated. They weren't allowed to be monks anymore, and they had to separate and live in different parts of the country. And yeah. Remembering the suffering of our spiritual ancestors can be hugely helpful when we deal with our own suffering. And just remembering they made it through, so we'll make it through too. And the practices that help them, the meditation, the chanting, the sutra study, those practices will help us as well. We have everything we need to get through this. We just have to be willing to put in the work. Okay. Anything else this evening before you wrap it up? Comments, questions, etc.? All right. Well, it looks like that's it. Thank you for joining me. Amitabha.